Hello, and welcome back to the Leading Digital Podcast. I'm Alistair Clifford Jones, the CEO of Leading. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Gyner Ozgul, the Chief Executive Officer of Fortis Fire Safety. Gyner started life managing restaurants and brings over 25 years of leadership experience across field service, technology, and supply chain roles. At Fortis Fire Safety, Gyner is focusing on building a people-first, technician-centric organization that delivers safety, reliability, and trust to every customer every day. On today's episode, we'll dive into why he believes the field engineer is so important, how technology is shaping the future, and what leadership will look like when you're balancing growth, culture, and building a business founded on empathy. I found the discussion absolutely fascinating, and I hope you do too. Hi, Gyner. Before we start, can you just give me a quick overview of your career journey and how you really got into field service leadership?
Yes, thanks, Alistair. So, like my career, I always say it has a couple of different components to it. The simplest way is this, I was a smart little 16-year-old who wanted money, so I started at a Burger King restaurant that was 2 blocks from my house, and um, worked there for 10 years, and ended up being a regional manager at one point. So spent 10 years in the restaurant industry. But what really got me into field services, I left my restaurant career and I started with a business that was owned by a company called Ecolab out of St. Paul, Minnesota, that did kitchen repair. So went from one side of the counter to the other side of the counter. At the time, it had 12 technicians. I had 12 technicians in my branch in Chicago. Those guys were great. They were very patient with me. I was a new guy coming from running restaurants to now running a repair industry, and service technicians or service engineers that actually fix the equipment in restaurants. And I spent the next 21 years in that business. The name of the business changed a few times. That was more marketing and business ownership than it was the business itself. But it culminated in a business called Smart Care about 20 years later. And I was the president and chief operating officer of that business as I left. And we had, I think, over 1,200 technicians at the time. And what was a super regional business back in 2003 when I joined, by the time I exited the business, it was a 1,200 technician strong, very national business. And, like other service leaders that are probably going to listen to this, I did a lot of things. I was a branch manager, a regional VP of ops. I worked in supply chain, worked in web sales for a period of time, and ran field service and customer service. I did a lot of jobs in that 20 years, just like everyone else. It's really what garnered the experience. Since leaving SmartCare, I've spent a couple years as a CEO of a residential roofing businesses, so the roofs over homes in the U.S. And then more recently, the last almost a year now, as the CEO of Fortis Fire on the shirt here, in which we have service engineers, and we provide kind of end-to-end solutions on fire safety, life and safety. So suppression, sprinkler, security, fire alarm, which is kind of a mission critical service for a lot of the commercial establishments in the U.S.
So it's amazing, starting off with 12 engineers and ending up with 1,200 in that
Yes.
particular organization. There must have been a few challenges to overcome. I'm sure it was never plain sailing in that 20 years. Anything particular that have shaped your journey, you think?
Yeah, I was, when I joined the business as a branch manager, I wasn't very technical, like being very transparent with folks. I can talk about pipe sizes and gas pressures and water pressures now, but, rewinding 25 years, like I was a restaurant guy who went into a service repair business, and sometimes that can be very intimidating. The best advice I got was from the branch manager, the incumbent I took over. He was moving on to a project. He said, just grab the book of customers and go visit technicians and do some jobs with them. That's the best way to learn the industry. And that's what I did. Like anytime a tech would call me, and it would almost happen every week where they needed a second set of hands to do an installation or do a repair, I volunteered to be the second set of hands. It didn't matter if it was 5 in the morning or 8 at night. I volunteered. I wanted to learn. I wanted to know what they did, and I wanted to appreciate the work that those technicians did in the field.
That's interesting. I mean, as a leader, you've had a number of different roles. You talked about that and probably worked in different organizational models to a certain extent from, working in a restaurant and then becoming a CEO of a business is fundamentally different. How do you operate as a leader in those different environments?
Yeah. I would say it's also an evolution of maturity.
Okay.
in my restaurant days, I didn't necessarily like I had a $30 million P&L at 26 years old, and I didn't really have an appreciation for what that meant. I think my leadership style then was very tactically focused. I ran really good restaurants and I built really good teams and really good restaurants. But it was very tactical, right? I wasn't mature enough yet to call myself a leader. I think at the time I was probably a really good manager. Now, some of the folks who still keep up with me from the Burger King days say I was a leader, but you know, I my leadership styles evolved throughout those years. Whereas, taking your example, I think I've become more servant over time is a leader. The idea that expertise doesn't mean you solve problems for people. It's expertise really are your proxy for listening better and adding value to collaborative conversations. I think that's where my evolution has become, right? So now if we have a challenging scenario to solve in the business, because I've worked in so many different businesses, industries, and functions, sometimes people look to you to give them the answer. And I really don't do that as a leader anymore. I want to collaborate. I want to offer input, and I want to use my expertise more to offer input to get to the right solution for the scenario I'm in. Because I think some of the mistakes people make as leaders is they assume their experience says, I must know how to do it right now. And it doesn't always, because the scenarios are very, very different. But I really care about the people in the services business. Like my focus is always at the technician level. And when I say technician, it's a proxy for constructions or service engineers or repairmen. To me, technicians covers a lot.
Yeah.
Um, and everything starts and kind of ends with them. And really the precipice of that was during COVID. We got to see how important that role was in the fabric of the world, right? When plumbing was out in your house or a fire was out in the kitchen, these guys didn't really have a break like a lot of the rest of the world did to go work from home, right?
Mm.
They put on their Tyvek suits and their masks and they went to work every single day, for the 2 years that there was a lot of uncertainty in the world. And, the output of that and the impact it had on me is the respect that I have is so much more for that role or those roles in kind of society now than I did that.
And that's interesting. I mean, I think the when you talk about they had to, everyone had to go out and do things. Now we seem to be talking about AI and the field service operative working from home almost. I mean, I know they do have to go out, but all this focus on AI, how do you see it transforming operations?
Yeah, I think there's like two forces in the world right now in terms of technical skilled labor. One is that whole workforce is shrinking across the globe. And it really is an output of like the last couple of decades of, frankly, society saying that the trades aren't great places to work, even though that's not, we're finding how untrue that those statements were 20, 30 years ago. We're paying for it now because that workforce is shrinking, right? And because that workforce is shrinking, AI is becoming more important in order to become the filter of what that technician should be doing versus what I call the nuisance repairs. Sometimes he'll go out and he'll find a breaker panel flipped and he flips a breaker panel. And yeah, I mean, it's not a big deal because you just build a customer an hour, you're getting your revenue, but it is a big deal because it takes him away from going to something he needs to go to, right?
Hmm.
And that's how I think AI first is going to start to help us. It's going to help offset some of this strain that we have in terms of staffing in the service world. The second piece is it's going to help optimize a lot of our routes and our efficiencies and how we think about delivering technicians with the right skills and the right competencies to solve problems for customers. Regardless if the customer is residential or commercial, they still have a problem to solve, and you want to match the competency to the problem. And I think AI can help make that a better scenario for us. I'd say we've tried to do it via software for many, many years unsuccessfully. But you put in all these dynamics in the software of his competency levels or the part stocking scenarios or his truck, and it's still not good, right? Because it's really hard to take the human element of analyzing so many variables and then making the best decision on a lot of variables, right? Whereas I think AI will have an ability to do that second. So really streamlining the operational, I'll call it dispatch of a technician. I think third is just becoming a resource for the technician itself. and helping them with not only on-site diagnostics and repair and streamlining the repair cycle while they're there, or installation or construction. All of those things are true, but also helping with the training. So I just said earlier in the conversation that workforce is constraining, right? So AI can potentially help us use the tools and the knowledge bases that it's starting to bring together and bring these newer technicians up to speed faster, right? Um, and people say, well, how do you think about hardware and AI glasses? I think the proxy is still up in the air. Whether it's the phones that we carry or the glasses that we wear is yet to be determined. But the data and the logic behind it, I think, is here and now to help the technician with the training side of the business.
So what? So with AI, you've got a workforce that's very nervous. They all think they're going to be replaced by a computer, yet you're giving them something that's going to help them. How does that kind of match in terms of implementation and challenges with putting some of this new technology in place?
Yeah, I think it's still a challenge, Alistair. And the example I have is a couple years ago, I spoke to a technician about AI, and he said, he had his service shirt on, so he had a pocket, right? And he pulled out his little notebook, and he said, Giner, what this notebook is? He goes, this is 30 years of experience in this notebook. And I have earned that experience over 30 years. I didn't have AI. I didn't have a lot of training. I had to teach myself that ability to go do diagnostics properly and repairs properly, right? So there's like this passion to retain that earned knowledge and not wanting to give it up. And I think there's definitely, whether it's explicit or implicit in organizations, it exists. You're going to have to push it to really get that answer out of technicians, but they're going to tell you, like, I don't know that I want to give up all my knowledge right away, right? Because I don't trust it, to you, the point you made, Alistair, which is a valid one, which is I don't want my job to go away. I think the reconciliation of helping them understand that the workforce is constraining and bringing in new blood, because now we're starting to talk about the trades as being the place to work, right? I think the CEO of NVIDIA just went on record saying the trades are where people are going to be making the most amount of money in the next 10 to 20 years. In recent days, I saw something on it. Like, for us to reconcile the need and the shortage of talent in technical spaces, we have to articulate to the group today, we need to build the knowledge base to help them to backfill you, right? So it's not a narrative of replacing your job. It's a narrative of how do we get talent into the industry, because at some point you're going to leave and we're going to be really tight on talent. It's going to get worse. So I think he's really articulating on the real narrative. I mean, the hands-on impact of building a building, and AI actually doing that as an example, or repairing plumbing in a wall or a fryer in a kitchen. I mean, we are decades away from that. I mean, there's so much hardware and software improvements that have to happen. I don't think that's a risk. I think that's where they go. And you need to kind of say, look, really what we're trying to do is improve the efficiency because of the lack of labor shortage, and build a backlog of talent to help us build the business going forward in perpetuity. And that's really the base use case that we need to do a better job with cultural change management on.
I really get the feeling that the field techs, whatever they happen to be doing, whatever activity, are the center of your world, in the sense you do really focus on them. Would you like to expand on that and how you keep them engaged?
For me, it's very simple. Like, I try to do as many ride-alongs a year as I can now. Unfortunately, I find myself in a lot of what I'll call value-driven activities as the leader of the organization in this role that maybe don't allow me as much as my past roles. But I made it a point to do that. And in past organizations, I even had like a whole month of tech recognition, and I would essentially tell the whole organization, anybody who wasn't a tech, that you have to go on a ride with a tech this month and really see what they do and really see what our customers like and dislike about us, frankly, and get it in the field. I think bringing the back office and the technicians together more often is really important. And it starts with me. I own it, right? So I think I've done probably a dozen ride-alongs this year myself. I got to keep doing that. because if I don't resonate and I don't really understand, then what happens is, like every organization, the more layers you have, the more filtering happens. So then you lose touch with what the priorities of the business are. And the priority is, when we started this call, I said that tech is my priority. In order for me to really keep that true, I have to be with the technicians more often.
So are people quite shocked when they do ride-alongs in the organization and they come back and they say, "Oh, I didn't realize this was happening"? Have you got any examples of that?
Oh yeah, they're always shocked. They're always shocked. It's yeah, I mean, I have plenty of examples. I'd say to have a billing supervisor who had rode with one of my techs a number of years back and understood that the customer's pain of our invoices and interpreting our invoices and having the customer say, and look, this is feedback they give our technicians who absolutely can do nothing about that, right? But they hear it
Mhm.
because they represent the company to the customer. So it was really, there's an example. We had a safety issue at one point where we found we had a lot of cuts on hands and our technicians weren't wearing enough safety gloves, right? And our safety manager went and did a number of ride-alongs and came back and found out that the feedback was very common from the technicians. Like, the gloves we're buying aren't giving me the dexterity I need to do the work. So you're asking me to wear these gloves and I want to support you, but look at me doing the work right now. And if I wear the glove, I can't do the work, right? So then we had to go find a little bit different glove with better dexterity, right? And define guidelines around when it's okay to not wear a glove, even though that might expose some of the risk, right? So if they're working on electronics or boards, it's really tough to do that with gloves on, right? Because of the dexterity that's needed. So yeah, I mean, you learn a lot when you spend the time in the field about what's working and what isn't working.
Yeah, it's always interesting, isn't it? Because you have an assumption that people just want to be on their own when they work in the field, but actually they do want to be part of a corporation as well. And I think a
Yeah,
lot of people forget that. They go, "You've chosen to do this job. You've chosen to do this." We've talked a lot about people in the field fixing things, but actually they are the focal point probably with customers and touch point with customers. How do you make sure that they're always representing your values as a business?
that's probably the hardest. That is probably the hardest thing to do, right? Because in most field service organizations, not all, but most, your technician is starting at home and ending his day at home. He doesn't have an office. He's not exposed to the culture of the organization every single day, right? So in order, you have to create as many touch points with that technician as you can to kind of bring that culture to that technician, to him or her, right? And when I say touch points, whether that be, every organization is a little different, whether that be the ride-alongs I've already mentioned, or doing the town halls, or reiterating training in your organization, or doing incentives to not only help the customer, but incent the technician to be part of the culture. All those things, some of those things are going to be relevant in your organization. You have to do it because otherwise it is just a job to that technician. Because remember, start at home, end at home. So if you don't take the time to figure out how you're going to build culture with a remote workforce, a remote service workforce, they're highly valued and they know it. And if you don't
Mhm.
build the culture to make them feel like they're part of something greater, they're going to find something else to do.
I think that's really interesting, isn't it? Because I think there is that whole dilemma of getting people in the field to think corporately in a way. So we've talked about technology, we've talked about the field engineer, we've talked about customer service, we've talked about your career as well. What do you think the future of field service is going to look like in maybe 5 years? Because we keep hearing about change. We've always heard about change, but I think it's slightly more exponential now.
Yeah, I think the next 5 years, and we talked a little bit about AI. I think AI, whether we like it or not, field service is the toddler who's going kicking and screaming a little bit, but they're going to end up having to embrace AI to whatever degree they do in their respective businesses. I think the second thing that's going to happen is we're starting to see blurred lines of trades, right? Because electronics are becoming such a bigger part of repairs in general. And when you think about electronics, whether that be energy saving technology, whether that be remote capabilities, whether that be remote service capabilities, all of those things mean the hardware itself is getting more complex to repair, right? So where maybe an electrician could repair a fryer in years past mechanically, Now you need somebody who's done electronics repair to repair the Wi-Fi card that's in that because it's doing some remote interface. Like there's bleeding lines starting to happen in the trades. And again, reiterating back to the AI, that's where it's going to help us understand what those blurred lines are and how do we get our technician workforce to feel comfortable working on things that traditionally they have not.
That's interesting, isn't it? Because I think though, whilst there are blurred lines, there's also more expertise they can get hold of via AI, etc. They can end up doing more things.
That's right.
Blurred lines and more activities. So
That's right.
it's like then they just become a super engineer.
Yeah,
And
for sure.
that's where the CEO of NVIDIA is right. They will be making all the money. What's next for you, Agina, in the next, 24 months, etc.?
Well, I'm gonna be the CEO of the company that's on my shirt here. And really my focus at Fortis is how do I build more culture into the business, right? Look, there's a whole bunch of mechanics behind the P&L and hiring and incentives and so all the normal things that all companies have, I have to do, right? So just assume those are all things we're working on. What I told our team a number of times is the biggest challenge we have ahead of us is change management and culture with all these kind of dynamics in play. So this idea of how do we put culture forward as we're making decisions on the P&L, as we're making decisions on hiring, how do we, as we make decisions on things like training and reinvestments in the business, culture has to be a part of that, and we need to make that more prevalent and more aware within the business. So that's kind of the next 12 to 24 months. I'm working on some side projects with myself, with a couple of other people in terms of things like this, but more maybe a little bit more deep, taking a series and talking through some of these things a little bit more in depth. But yeah, I mean, my primary focus is working with technicians and building the culture at.
I always like to just finish on a bit of a light-hearted note. So I guess a couple of questions, really. I mean, one, what's the most unusual challenge you've ever had in terms of field service?
Wow. When I had to figure out how to take, well, field service, I was a supply chain guy for a while behind the scenes in the business. So I was responsible for getting inventory right on the vehicles. I used to be the guy that was complaining about it, and then I became the guy who was accountable for it.
That always works well, doesn't it, in an
Yeah,
organization?
it was it was super challenging, right? Because we were in an industry where there are tens of thousands of models of pieces of equipment, right? And just to give some data behind it, 24,000 SKUs moved 4 or greater times a year, right? 24,000.
Mm.
So it's like, well, how do you stock a vehicle successfully when the movement is like the sheer amount of SKUs that you have movement on are so large, right? So
Mhm.
we got really creative with things like understanding text zones and geographies. And I had a great team at the time and great leadership at the time. They're still there at that business. Some of them, I mean, they were amazing. That was probably the biggest challenge I had in my career was doing that. And again, it took us about a year and a half to 2 years to really get good at it. But
Wow.
we got really, really good at it for a period of time.
Wow. And if finally, if you had a magic wand, what would you solve in terms of field service or
Well,
anything business wise?
my magic wand would be the word empathy. I think, the whole business culture of this has lost a little bit of the empathy of patience, the empathy of understanding, the empathy of listening. And I'd say to the listener group broadly, like waving the wand of empathy and like stepping back sometimes as a leader and really trying to understand what's going on and giving yourself, if you need a few minutes or a few hours or a few days to solve it better, then say that, own it, own the empathy of that, and go do it that way, right?
Yeah.
Because sometimes we're so adept to reacting in service businesses because that's our clients, right? We're typically reacting to a problem. So what that does is it influences our leadership behaviors that it means we have to have immediacy to react on everything. Or immediacy means now versus immediacy could be okay with, hey, if I did this tomorrow or maybe a little bit next week and I came back with a better answer for my technicians and my organization, right? I could solve the problem in a much better manner than the immediacy of now. So what I'd say is my answer to your question is I'd wave the wand of empathy to say, step back a little bit, really try to understand and empathize with your team members and try to solve problems differently and better for your organization.
It's fascinating. That's actually quite enlightening. Yeah. Because
Thank you.
some people have just sort of thought, if I had a magic wand, what I'd do is I'd solve the algorithm issues on, trying to get workforces around the place.
Everything starts with people, right?
Yeah.
Whether that be AI or solving customer problems or anything we've talked about the last, 27 minutes or so here, it all starts with people. So
Mm.
if we can empathize and start to understand what the other person is thinking better, we can solve a lot of these problems in a better manner, right? And more permanently. And that's what we're all trying to do every day, right? Is solve
Yeah.
it right. And that's why the empathy is so important.
Fascinating. Well, look, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Alistair.
Thanks.